Okay, guys, I guess I'm going to make this a three-part bit. So I was talking about how Claire Chenault and Joseph Stilwell essentially joined the Chinese after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and how this was, even though it took a long time and it was kind of a comedy of errors, this was essentially the turning point where the combined force of the Chinese plus the material of the Americans would essentially stall out the Japanese until the American military, kind of in the Pacific, was able to bomb Japan and release Japanese or make Japan surrender. Now, before this, that's kind of at the end of World War II. But kind of the great debate during this time period was the Chinese were able to actually, or the Chinese, oh, Jesus Christ, the Japanese were able to move through Southeast Asia quicker than they were in Japan, partially because as than they were China. Japan was able to move through Southeast Asia quicker than they were in China because as kind of much of a mess as China was, a lot of these Southeast Asian countries were colonies of European powers whose military was under siege in Europe and essentially could not commit people to the Asian theater. And so there were some local troops within Southeast Asia, some resistance fighters, but for the most part, Vietnam, controlled by the French, uh, Malaysia, controlled by the British, uh, Indonesia, controlled by the Dutch, and most importantly, Myanmar or Burma, controlled by the British, as well as the independent country of Thailand that didn't offer too much resistance, even though they were independent. The important one is Burma, because what Burma did was it cut off the road from the Indian Ocean that was supplying these huge number of supplies that I'm talking about to the Chinese area in Sichuan, in Chongqing, in Yunnan. Um, and so they had to find a way to get supplies there. That it cut off the Burma Road, I should say. That's what the road was that ran, obviously, through Burma to these areas in southwest China uh, that were supposedly going to turn around the war. Well, that's when we had flying the hump, when American supply trains or planes essentially went over the Himalayas and supplied Chiang Kai-Shaek. Now, they obviously couldn't do that on the scale that a road did, so recapturing the road was important. But at the same time, you had to fight off the majority of troops that were advancing, if advancing more slowly, from the Japanese troops into southwest China. So that was really where the great debate was. Stilwell was all for sending troops to open the road and letting what happened may happen in China and just hoping that he can get the road opened up before there was a total victory for the Japanese in China. Whereas Chenault, a very big proponent of air power, as well as Chiang Kai-Shek, for the obvious reason that he was more concerned about his own country than he was, though he wanted supplies, he was more concerned about the defense of his own country than he was about Southeast Asia. Wanted the majority of troops to be in China. Um, and so again, there was a comedy of errors both ways. Stilwell, for a time period, actually didn't desert, but kind of went on this small march. I think it was like of 20 men himself to escape the Japanese without telling anybody what he was going to do. So he was MIA for a while. Um, the troops that were in China, especially during the, let's see if I can find the campaign, uh, the Ichago campaign, which was really sort of like the last burst in terms of taking a gambit by the Japanese. Not that they still didn't have superior military technology, at least compared to the Chinese, but because they were really running short on funds, on material, on men, they just didn't have enough resources to fully push into China. But they gave one last go, and it was really a pretty dangerous go in the Ichago campaign that consolidated. I talked about the pincer movements that happened around the lower Yangtze or the middle Yangtze River. They took over all that. They pushed through Guilin, which a lot of historians say the same place where the Chinese or the communist retreat happened. In the same city, that a lot of historians say that if the United States had put more, or the Chinese had put more military in there, that might have been the Waterloo or the Stalingrad or whatever you want to call it for the Japanese, because they had really kind of run out of resources. But only a local commander, not anybody from the national. They controlled a fair number of men, but the local commander, rather than a larger national force troop, defended the city and essentially let Guilin fall, which opened it up more directly to Kunming, the Yunnan capital that was one of the key supply routes, in addition to Burma, to Chongqing and the center for the Chinese nationalist resistance. So eventually, though, even though they won all their battles in the Ichago campaign, it petered out. The United States coming in from the east, coming in from the Pacific Ocean, famously dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending World War II. Something also important during this time period is the Chinese and the Japanese did have an armaments, and but what was the degree that the communists contributed to the anti-Japanese campaign? Well, really, it wasn't very much. There was the Battle of Bing Xingguan, where what was most impressive of that was not necessarily the size, but the fact that the communists, their most impressive thing during this time period is that they were able to march very quickly over a relatively long distance. We're talking, I don't know, 300 miles or so, to engage in this battle by essentially containing a Japanese force in this canyon. They were able to defeat the Japanese in this individual battle, even though they actually, the communists took on more total losses. They were able to kind of win the battle, at which point they retreated back to their base in Yunnan. There were the Japanese campaign against the communists during this time period was known as the Three Alls. And if historians say that the nationalists were hurt by World War II that allowed the communists to come to power, they're ignoring the Three Alls, which was essentially a campaign of scorched earth, much like in the South, to defeat the communists. And during the Three Alls, the communists were at their probably weakest at any point since their move out from southern China during the Long March. So they really didn't contribute a whole lot, but they did contribute, and most of all, they hung on. That was such an important thing for the communists until after World War II, that they just hang on and they don't be completely defeated. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrenders. What happens? Well, there's a couple key things that happen. First, Russia takes Manchuria. Now, unlike more sort of base reports or commonly held reports, the Red Communists, the Soviets, did not give Manchuria right away to the Red Communists of China. Stalin did not give it to Mao Zedong right away. Then they were initially going to give it to the nationalists. The nationalists took, we'll get back to that area in a second. The nationalists took over big chunks of the country, but what you have to remember is the communists were very good at filling in power voids, particularly in these small-scale Soviets, particularly in their appeals to landlords. Something about the nationalists throughout their entire time period was even if Chiang Kai-Shek had control of all sort of the top crust of society, either through coalition or through military defeat, the vast majority of society was agrarian peasants. We're talking, 95% of society. Um, and although they had no organizational backing, they were essentially non-aligned until Mao was really able to use his communist message to varying degrees of success, but enough of a success um, to defeat the or to instill some sort of insurgency a spirit of insurgency against the nationalists. Uh, so while the nationalists were able to take over, it was a void. There was dissent, but the nationalists still had the troops. So what did the communists do? The nationalists took over. Let me get to the next page. Took over Yunnan. Took over, or not Yunnan, but Yan'an, the previous military base of the communists. Forced the communists into a very famous battle in Kagan, where again the communists lost. The communists are in the retreat again. This is an area not that far from Peking. This is about 1946. Pushed them up into Manchuria, where the communists essentially went into the furthest retreat in the very north part of the province in Harbin. The Soviets did eventually turn over their territory, or essentially what they did is they eventually withdrew and then de facto ceded it to the communists. Again, it was a power void. The communists were able to move in, but unlike in the rest of the country where the nationalists had military power and then the communists had like propaganda power, the communists were able to move their troops up into Harbin and control there. That was really where post World War II, where they were at their weakest. But the communists were able to rally, move south into Mercadin, move south into Jilin, move south into Chinchu, and essentially, kind of in the same way that the Soviets quickly made Nazi Germany fall once the tide of war had turned, really pretty quickly took over all of Manchuria, took over back over Yan'an, their old capital. I think the nationalists maybe controlled that for a year after the war. So took the areas around the Yellow River, including the very important area of Zhuzhou. Surrounded Beiping, or what's now known as Beijing, cutting that off from the majority of nationalists in the south, and eventually controlled the northern half of the country. Now, this was really when we could have seen like a East-West Germany, a North-South Vietnam, where the country was split. But you got to remember that Chiang Kai-Shek had gotten on the last nerves of the Americans in World War II. He had been successful, but much like with many of his other coalition building or whatever, he did not ingratiate them. And unlike those other people that didn't really have recourse, the United States was really the one that held power, and they chose to only nominally help China or nationalist China in southern China. So once Zhu fell, it really felt like it was only a matter of time, even though communism in the South was not nearly as strong as communism in the North, at least post Long March. Nanjing fell in April of 1949, Shanghai in May of 1949. It was supposedly going to be, I keep mentioning Stalingrad, because that was where Chiang's economic base was and was really sort of the city of whatever during that time period. Let's see. During that time period, they thought there was going to be huge resistance there, but the truth of the matter was that kind of under the table businessmen largely paid people to just kind of stay off, and the communists were able to take that area fairly easily. Chiang Kai-Shek moved his capital to uh, Chongqing and then Qingdao, both in Sichuan, and sort of like a deja vu of the Japanese in World War II, but was not able to hold out. It was really a tidal wave at this point, and then moved the last of his troops after visiting his childhood home. Before Nanjing fell, he had paid tribute to Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the country that I previously mentioned. Was able to moved all his troops to Taiwan, and it eventually led to the fall of China to the communists and the end of the power rule of Chiang Kai-shek. A few troops moved across the border into Southeast Asia, into their old territory of Burma, and actually became huge players in the opium and therefore heroin area of the Golden Triangle. The majority of troops moved to Taiwan. The United States sent in boating, what do I want to say, Navy, sent in their Navy to essentially act as a stopgap between the communists in China and the nationalists in Taiwan. Again, the communists being all powerful on land, but not really having any capacity at sea. So once the United States did that, it was pretty much set that Taiwan was going to act as a separate political entity from that of mainland China. And that's really where the book ends. Chiang Kai-shek lived 24 or 25 more years, I believe, in, if you want to call it, exile in Taiwan. And his political influence was very large there, but his reign of rule in outside of propaganda that the Chinese would use against him in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, his influence essentially in China was over. And that's where the book ends. So anyway, I know that this is very, very long, but these reviews are very, very long. But they're very, very long because Chiang Kai-shek is a really interesting figure, and you guys should check this out. All right, Chiang Kai-shek, China's Generalissimo and the Nation He Lost, by Jonathon Fenby. If you sat through all three parts of these reviews, you should win $1 million. All right, guys. See you later, and check out my next reviews, which will probably be a little bit shorter. All right, bye.